Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I'm going to spoil my husband and make him a summer shirt. So, I'm going to be pulling out my golden rule. The golden rule is a system that contains a lot of patterns. Matter of fact, 280 of them. We will need to draw out the patterns, so the system does come with our dressmaking rulers and a book with 280 patterns. So this entire book does have patterns, and it does have some men patterns. But if you like making men's clothes, you can get a supplement all for men's clothing. The supplement gives us casual, business, sweatshirts, jackets, even a house coat. So the shirt I'm going to make my husband is the one right at the very front. I do want to make him a casual shirt, short-sleeved for summer. So on the front, we do have the pattern picture and number. And when we turn the page over, this is the pattern in miniature size that we get to blow up. And I do have a video all about how to enlarge these patterns. I will be making that short sleeve shirt. So I'll take the special tape measure and measure the chest of my husband. And then I'll get to use the special end of this tape measure that consists of this plastic with holes. He is 114 centimeters, so I will use that hole corresponding to that 114. Now I do photocopy my patterns, and that way I can leave them nicely intact for next time. So I end up being able to have them like this, and I do cut them out. I cut out those little diagrams and I put them on a piece of paper, and then I'm able to use this ruler to enlarge this pattern. I will put a link in the description on how this system works in more detail. But the basic is I am putting a pin in that measurement. You're going to find an X marks the spot. That X is going to go down. We will see some little measurements that I'm going to be able to follow. So in this case, it's 42. I slide this over to 42 and put dots. From there, I'm going to be able to draft it out. So I'm going to have this little diagram blown up to the size that is exactly the size I'm needed. And in this case, it's the 114 centimeters. Most of the patterns have this little X in the middle of a pattern. So we can see an X in the sleeve, an X in the middle of the front and the back, the other sleeves. Some of them will just give you measurements because they're square or rectangular. So you're going to be able to just put those measurements on. There are some pieces like the collars that are too small to have the X's in the middle. So the X's are to the side. So today I want to show you how to draft out some of these pieces where the X's are not in the center. And then I'm going to share with you some of my other favorite tips on how to make sure all of these pieces work out. And I'll show you some tips on how I am going to be making my husband his shirt. So this portion of the collar, that X is way too small to have in that collar. So the X is beside the diagram. I will still need to put my measurement right there at that X. And I will still be following these lines. And I do just tape that little diagram down on that wool mat. It's only for a few minutes, so that tape won't bother it. I do have the pin in the right measurement. X marks the spot. Now I can smooth over and start marking my measurements. So I have a 28, 33, 25, and so on. Once I have all the dots done, I'm going to be able to join the dots. There is one line that has two measurements on it. So we have a measurement 21 and a measurement 25. So with that same line, we're going to put those two dots. I'm going to just take that and transfer it into the middle where those dots are going to be. Now I get to join those dots. The picture is a good indication on how the pattern is going to look. So I do have that fold, which I will mark as a fold. And the dots have a very slight curve, so I will use the ruler with a slight curve. And just by moving that ruler, we can line up all of those dots. And I join the dots. So I'll exaggerate these dots here so that you can see them. So we're going to be able to move this curved ruler until those dots line up, and then the straight one. So this is that one collar that I'm going to be needing. So I now can add my seam allowance. Once the pattern pieces have been drafted out, I do some comparisons just to check my own work. For example, I do want the sides to match up for the front and the back. So even though I have drafted out both that front and the back, I will lay those edges together. And this is a side seam, which I know will need to match. So I put my pages together and I make sure that they are identical. So that curve and the length will be the same for this pattern piece. Another area where the pieces really do need to fit together are the two shoulder seams. So I match those shoulder seams. And if they're not the same, then I need to make them the same. I do tape my pieces right onto the pattern before I draft them out. So I can always go in and recheck those measurements if I find that they're not matching up. And when I do match them up, I am matching up to the original stitching line, not the seam allowance. The seam allowance is where you can come off a little bit. So I fold back that seam allowance and match up those seams. I also like to put little notches on my pattern pieces so that I can match them up as I'm stitching them together. We're going to be able to match up those notches with each dot if we really wanted to. For example, here is the sleeve. I have the center point and 4 little circles. Those 4 little circles will match. So I have the center and then 4 little circles. So each of these little circles will actually be notches. So for the sleeve, I do have a center point. My side seams, I have 3 on the back and 3 on the front. So they match the 3 on the back and those 3 on the front. So that is also going to go for the side seams. We have that center mark in the side, so it's going to match the center for the back. So if we really wanted to, we could mark the entire pattern to follow those notches. The fabric that I'm going to be using is a double gauze. So it's a cotton fabric. So when we look really close, we will see the double layer of fabric. If you only have one piece, then that would be a single gauze. But because we have 2, this is a double gauze. It's 100% cotton, it's very light, and it's very comfortable with that little extra stretch. The cotton fabric itself is not stretchy, it's the way it's woven, and it's very soft. So this is the way the fabric is when you buy it. You can still see that it has a little bit of crinkling, but when you wash it, it crinkles up a lot more. So these two pieces were the same size. And you can see where we definitely have lost some size. So the fabric really hasn't shrunk any, it's just gone to its natural state. So this is how that fabric's going to look like after it's washed. So it's important that we sew with it already washed because we do not need the shirt to become any smaller. Because this fabric definitely has some give involved, we will need to stabilize certain areas as we're sewing them. So I do like to take a thin fusible interfacing and make it the measurement that the pattern is. And that way, when I go to sew whatever that area is together, it is stabilized. It hasn't stretched out of proportion, so both that front and the back is going to match. I did a 5/8 seam allowance. I sewed those two edges together. I trimmed off one edge and then pressed it towards the back. I did a little top stitch, so it does give a very pretty finish. Another area that stretches out is this neckline. So it's important that we stabilize it and then do that stitching row along the edge to stabilize it. This will stretch and not match that collar if we do not stabilize it. To match the sleeve up to the body, we don't need to stabilize it. But I still do that 5/8 seam allowance. Here's one of those notches that I've put in. And I do want this seam to be pressed and stitched down on top of the sleeve. So it's coming onto that sleeve. So I will go in and trim off a little bit of that seam allowance towards the sleeve and do a serge or a zigzag stitch right along that top edge. Then I'll be able to press that down and from the front do a row of top stitch holding the seam allowances onto that sleeve. So I have the top stitch on the shoulder going to the back and a top stitch to put that seam allowance onto the sleeve. Now when this is washed, even when it wrinkles a little bit more, you're not going to have any seam allowances going one on one side, another inch going on another direction. It's all going to stay flat on the same area. So it's going to give it a very professional and a nice finish no matter how many times you wash this. For the pocket, I did stabilize the inside just around that little corner, pressed it over, and then top stitched it on. So when we look inside, there's just a very lightweight stabilizer, keeping that pocket nice and flat. And whenever I've done any pressing at all, I have always maintained an up and down motion versus an ironing. I do not want the fabric to go back to that tight state. I want to work with it to its natural state. For the collar, I want to stabilize my fabric before I cut the collar out. So here's the pattern for that neckband. What I've done is, instead of cutting it on a fold, I've made the pattern in one full piece. I can still fold it in half if I want to use it, but by making that full piece, it gives me the size that I'm going to need to put my interfacing on. So this is just a very lightweight, fusible interfacing. So the glue side is that bumpy side. I'm going to be able to lay this down. Now I know I'm going to need two of these, one for the front and the back. So I'm just going to roughly cut out that interfacing. Now I'm going to be able to take that and bring this piece to the iron and fuse it onto an area that I want. And now without any stretching, I'm going to just iron this down until all of this is stuck on. And I'm going to do that for that neckband and for the collar. Then I'm going to be able to cut out those pieces after it's all been stabilized together. So here's that neckband that has that soft fusible web on it. You can still see it does have that nice wrinkled, relaxed look to it, but it is stabilized, so it's not going to stretch out of shape. So this pattern came with the shirt in a short sleeve and a long sleeve and the vest. So we had the vest, the long sleeve, short sleeve, and the shirt all in the back. We were just able to blow up those measurements just by joining the dots. And I now have the shirt ready for the buttons. It's a short sleeve summer shirt. I did put the stabilizer in the shoulders so that it didn't stretch out of place. The seams were top stitched down on that shoulder and on that sleeve. I continued that top stitching along the front, around the pockets, and along the curved bottom. Now, as much as I would like to finish this today, there is one thing that I did forget picking up, and it's the buttons. So I'm going to have to wait and bring this to the store and choose some buttons. But we can see how versatile these patterns are. And it's really handy to have all of these men's patterns handy, and we can make them for any of the gentlemen in our home. We only need those two basic measurements, the chest and the waist. And the last thing I do is I attach a little piece of fabric onto this pattern. And that way, if I want to change the pattern in any way, I can refer to the original shirt. So with my golden rule set and that supplement for men, I was able to get a new shirt, or at least my husband was able to get a new shirt. I will often go to the fabric store with the booklets and the supplements, and that way I can choose the pattern to go with what fabric is available. A lot of times there's a fabric that I really wanted to use, but I didn't have a pattern, so carrying it with me to the fabric store really helps, because they also give you an approximate on how much fabric you're going to need. I will put a link in the description to a video where I talk more on how to draft these out yourself with those measurements. But for now, I need to go back to the fabric store and get some buttons. I think maybe subconsciously I forgot the buttons on purpose so that I could, well, go back to the fabric store. I do hope you found those tips and tricks that I like to use while designing the fabrics and working with this soft fabric helpful. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're working on next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.